Hello, my name is Louise MacDonald, and I arrived in Pemberton in the summer of 1993. I hate to tell you this, but I didn't know anything about Pemberton. I didn't know the name. I'd never heard of it, but here I arrived. Friday evenings in Vancouver, where I lived, I used to rush home from work, throw the bird cage on the front seat of the car, the cooler and the stove and my food box in the trunk, and I'd head out for the weekend somewhere. I wanted to leave Vancouver, but I didn't know where to go. I just wanted to get out of the city. And I used to head up the Fraser Canyon and the valley and all around there. And one day I headed towards Squamish, so I spent a couple of days in Squamish looking around, and then went back home to Vancouver and thought, well, no. Next weekend I headed up past Squamish. I was getting a little more daring, going along the highway, and saw a creekside and did some hiking, went back home. The next weekend I kept on the road, and the scenery changed, and I felt this excitement. And I came down the hill past 1 Mile Lake, and I looked around, and there was a sign there saying Pemberton. I thought, Pemberton? Oh. And I went down the hill and around the corner and across a 1-lane bridge with weeping willows over it, over what I found out was the Arn Canal. And as I crossed the bridge, I was just looking around smiling, and there was a whoop whoop, and I pulled over, and a police car pulled up behind me, and this man comes up to the window and taps on the window, and I opened it and I said, "Isn't it pretty?" And he said, "Young lady, do you realize you're supposed to pull over before you go across a 1-lane bridge? You don't know if somebody's coming from the other side." Well, this turned out to be Sergeant Bruce Waite, and I didn't know at that point that I would be working with him one day. So I continued up the highway, and pretty soon the highway ended at a dirt road, and I kept going and ended up at a big lake, and the sign had said Birkenhead Lake. And I thought, Birkenhead Lake? Well, my dad talked about Birkenhead Lake. I didn't know it was here. He had a cabin here. So I pulled up for the night. Now this is in the summer, and these days you wouldn't believe it. There was nobody around. I pulled the car up by the boat ramp, and I settled in and made my dinner. Suddenly the sky grew black, and the wind came up really fiercely. Limbs were flying through the air, and I thought, oh my gosh, nobody knows I'm here. They're hitting the car, they're flying all around, the waves are getting higher and higher. What if something happens? I better get the heck out of here. So I turned around and I left, and I thought, when I started to come into Pemberton by the lake, I noticed in the bushes a cattle guard. I thought, I'll go in there. So I kept driving, came back through into Pemberton, and I noticed the cattle guard, and I crossed over. It was pretty rough, wooded, overgrown, and I end up behind the lake. And there's a grove of trees, and underneath the grove of trees is a circle, and there's a stone fire pit, and 2 logs halved for people to sit on, and I thought, oh. So I settled in for the night. The next day, a girl comes walking along with a great big dog, and we start chatting, and she said, "This is 1 Mile Lake." And I said, "Well, where's the town?" Well, she said, "When you go through, before you cross the bridge, you have to make a sharp left, and then you'll come into the town." Oh, I said, I didn't know. So she said, "I don't like you camping here. It worries me. I think you better come to my house this afternoon for tea, and maybe you'll stay the night. Oh, well, I said that would be very nice. So she gave me directions, and I found my way through town. There was a few buildings. I was surprised. I drove through the rest of town. I didn't see anybody. I went back to the lake and stayed another night, and a gentleman came by. I said, "Oh, good morning." He said, "I'm just checking for bottles. Sometimes the teenagers come over and have parties here." I said, "Oh, there's no teenagers came over last night. It's been very quiet." So we got talking, and he said, "Are you staying long?" And I said, "Well, it's very nice here. I'd like to stay. In fact, I'm looking for a new home." But I said, "I kind of looked around yesterday. There's nothing available here." Oh, he said, "You have to talk to George. Give me your name and your phone number and I'll give it to George. He'll phone you and set you up." I said, "Oh, okay." So I gave him my name and number, and off I went back home that day. As I went up the hill past the lake, I felt like I was leaving home. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. Pretty soon George phoned me. He said, "Louise, hello, this is George Underhill. Well, you're interested in moving to Pemberton. Well, if you come up in October, I'm bringing 2 mobile homes in and you can have a look at them." So I got a phone call in October. I came up. The rain here was unbelievable. I stepped out of the car, it was icy rain. And I went down on my back, and I was soaking wet, and I jumped up, and George came up to me and introduced himself. And he said, "Come and look at this place, Louise. I'm so glad you're here. I think you'll like it." And I looked at it and I'm thinking, I don't want to live in a tin can. I don't know anything about mobile homes. He showed me the place and I never even stepped in the door. I just looked. I said, "George, where will I put my dining set?" "Well, right here." I said, "There isn't room." "Oh, well, come and look at the second place, Louise." So we stepped across this muddy, icy road, and the rain, I couldn't believe it. We stepped into the doorway of another place, and it was like, I just looked around, and George was smiling, and I said, "Oh, this is so nice." "Well," he said, "it won't be set up till December, but you come back then and we'll make arrangements to bring your furniture up." I said, "All right." And there it was, all settled, just like that. And here I am. Nikki got a hold of me, and she hasn't let her clutches off me ever since. And I am doing something that I really enjoy. I'm going to be reading to you today about the first Pemberton and the gold rush. The first Pemberton and the gold rush. Although it is probable that Lil'wat Nation of the Pemberton area had heard of Europeans before 1827, that seems to be the year in which Hudson's Bay men first penetrated the valleys of the Birkenhead and Lillooet rivers. Francis Ermatinger arrived then by way of Seaton and Anderson Lakes, and James Murray Yale came 3 years later, having made the trip north from Fort Langley. In all likelihood, both men were searching for a safe route for fur brigades between Kamloops and Fort Langley, for a route to bypass the lower Fraser River canyons. The Hudson's Bay men were the first of many Europeans who would examine routes through Pemberton in order to link the interior and the coast. Some used the waterway connecting Cayush, now Lillooet, and Langley. Others climbed up and down the rocky hills between Pemberton and Howe Sound. The explorers of the 1850s and 1860s, unlike the earlier men, were concerned with the transport of gold, not of furs. For a few years after Anderson's visit, People living along the Birkenhead and Lillooet systems, as far as is known, had little contact with white men. Then came the Fraser River gold discoveries that would lure thousands of transients and some settlers into these peaceful valleys. Probably few, if any, could understand the feelings of the Lillooets as they saw strange men from Canada, the United States, Europe, and Asia pouring through the country, and as they saw some of the strangers settling. In 1858, the miners who had somehow reached the Fraser goldfields and intended to stay through the winter created an urgent problem for Governor Douglas of Vancouver Island. They needed food, and that food had to be transported to regions above the lower canyons of the Fraser, into the mainland area to which there were no roads. Even though not governor of the mainland until November, Governor Douglas knew he had to act, because he knew that 12 years earlier, A.C. Anderson, a fur trader, had traveled from Cayush by a chain of lakes to Langley. In July, Douglas asked the fur trader to survey a route linking all lakes between the north end of Harrison Lake and the Fraser. The total length of trail would be just over 68 miles. The total length of all lakes, nearly 56 miles. 500 miners eager to reach the gold-bearing Fraser River bars volunteered to build the trails. They established Port Douglas and constructed a trail called Douglas Portage to the south end of Lillooet Lake, and there raised a building at what would be known as Port Lillooet. Then in early September, a party of men climbed out of rowboats that had taken them to the north end and prepared logs for a house which would stand a few hundred yards from an Indian village. The Victorian Gazette correspondent described the event in these words: "We went to work with a will at building another log house at the spot designated, which I believe has been named Port Pemberton. The name honored Joseph Despard Pemberton, Surveyor General of Vancouver Island." That log building was probably Port Pemberton's first. The little port developed to serve the gold rush, and a nearby farming settlement grew as mining traffic increased on its way to El Dorado. Then very quickly, when traffic shifted to a route better than the one between Harrison Lake and Cayush, most of the settlers moved on. One of the assets of the area would become widely known, the richness of the land, and small waves of settlement would continue until a new Pemberton would replace the first Port Pemberton. Through September and October 1858, trail construction went on, though slowed by lack of enough mules to pack provisions. By mid-October, the rough 29-mile Pemberton Portage Trail to Anderson Lake was nearly ready for men and pack animals, and the miners who had decided to winter above the lower canyons of the Fraser would not starve. Port Pemberton received the increasing hordes of gold seekers. Some of them were women. All of these people headed to several areas around Lytton to the Bridge River, and by 1860, the Caribou. Soon mule trains wound along both Douglas and Pemberton Portage. But the snows of 1858-59 winter forced mules off the trails, and then the Indians did the freighting, some carrying 100-pound sacks through the deep snow, others bringing up goods in their canoes. their charge of 5 cents a pound was 10 cents less than that of the packers. For a time, flat-bottom boats moved regularly between Port Lillooet and Port Pemberton. While the trail builders had slashed and grubbed out the trail, another group of men had taken out timbers for 2 boats large enough to transport animals, as well as freight over the lake. Officials of the road building party tried to stop freighting across the lake by any except their own men. But in October, a Chinese company was still ferrying provisions across Lillooet Lake. Then in June 1860, the locally built 65-foot Marzelle began carrying the sorted cargo for mines and miners. At least one creature who embarked on the little ship did not survive the trip. Henry Bulode's horse, Old Moki, kicked an ox overboard into the lake. By August 1860, Port Douglas merchants had imported a number of wagons. By 1863, from that port, along the narrow rocky valley of the lower Lillooet, a 4-horse stage spread north daily, numerous heavy wagons towards the mines. Lieutenant R.C. Maine, Royal Navy, reported that the engineers' road connecting Douglas, the year camels plodded the Harrison-Lillooet route. Some shipments suffered and lawsuits followed. Some accidents. At the first whiff of a camel, according to one writer, mules and oxen did everything but climb trees. Anderson and Seton Lakes also had steamer service. In September 1860, Governor Douglas reached Anderson Lake, just in time for the trial trip of the Lady of the Lake. Traffic began to increase even more rapidly. Lillooet Indians like Dr. Joseph of Darcy and Paul Dick's father were hired to transfer the stacks of freight from shore to ship and back to shore, or to sand during low water at Pemberton. Provincial records show that river steamers preferred Indian crews because they were most willing and active. Captain Golding, the owner of the Marzelle, must have foreseen the need of a larger steamer to carry the mountains of freight and numerous passengers disgorged from freight and stage lines. Somewhere along Lillooet Lake, he built the 115-foot Prince of Wales, as big as 4 others, according to Paul Dick. On June 7, 1863, Golding wrote Governor Douglas, and heading the letter, Prince of Wales, said that the new steamer was making regular trips directly from the 29-mile house on Tenas Lake, 6 miles south of Lillooet Lake, to Port Pemberton. While the ship was under construction, he had been building the dam recommended 4 years earlier by Lieutenant Palmer in order to bring Tenas and Lillooet Lakes to the same level. The dam was incomplete, but until dam completion in September, Golding expected to be able to operate from the lower lake during high water. He probably had his fine ship winched through the dangerous passage between the lakes. Joe Peters used to tell of Indians winching steamers through such waters. The great volume of traffic required some accommodation at Pemberton. By 1859, the port had 5 or 6 log cabins, shelters and eating places for the men who rowed the large boats, for the mule drivers, and for the traveling public. The 2 restaurants offered the usual Gold Rush menu at the usual prices: bacon and beans, bread and butter, tea or coffee for $1. The 1860 Royal Engineers map shows 14 buildings of various sizes, with 3 named: shed, mule shed, and lake house. Records give names of 2 businessmen operating in early Pemberton. Mr. Drinkall's Pemberton House catered to travelers, offering them meals and places to sleep. Otis Parsons' store offered a variety of goods to miners and to residents. Robbins and Waldron in 1859 bought 13 pounds of bacon for $9.75, a horse for $75, and brandy, for which they paid $50. Payment was partly or altogether in gold dust. Whether the buildings bordering the road that wound through the port could accommodate the 600 pack mules said to have wintered in Pemberton in 1861 is doubtful. Those animals could have spent much of the winter grazing near the lake, for many animals have survived in that way. Several large buildings sheltered the freight animals which regularly left the settlement and returned to it, and one of these stables was the only structure damaged in the rock slide that roared down towards Pemberton in 1864. Of all the buildings in Port Pemberton, those stables must have been the busiest, noisiest, and smelliest. Otis Parsons, packing for Nelson, used one of them. Billy Ballou used another. He was a packer from Douglas until his rival, Frank Bernard, took over his business. Imagine early mornings beside the lake, lanterns bobbing as men in charge of animals hurried out to winter and feed, men forking out hay hauled from lands near the town. Later, men packing mules and camels, a general clanking and shouting, barking dogs, wagons loaded the day before with tools, clothes, food, and whiskey for the mines, oxen led out and hooked up to their loads with shoes and wheels grating on rocks, the cracks of whips, and more shouts. No quiet for late sleepers, but with everybody pushing either themselves or freight northward, few could be interested in sleeping past dawn anyway. The route to the gold fields opened a route for farmers to reach the meadowlands above Lillooet Lake, Pemberton or Lillooet Meadows. According to Governor Douglas, these new people settled about 5 miles from the port. Even during the first years of Port Pemberton's existence, they were staking land below the wall of Mount Currie, land that was among the first privately held land on the mainland. Gold rush traffic, both 2- and 4-footed, provided them with a market larger than later farmers would reach until construction of the Pacific Great Eastern Railway and the resulting link with Vancouver. Fresh vegetables had been extremely scarce and dear. For these reasons, in 1859, Chief Justice Begbie gave several seasonal permits for use of land, 40 acres being 5 acres each to 8 men, at the halfway house between Anderson Lake and Lillooet Lake, and Mr. Bryant applied for 250 acres near Pemberton. With tomatoes selling for as much as 75 cents each, and cucumbers at $1, farmers never did better. In 1859, one settler had cleared upwards of 240 pounds sterling an acre growing potatoes. Prices dropped in half once the wagon road was finished as far as Tenas Lake, but the oldest and principal settler, having the next year a much larger crop, expected to make even higher profits. Ketterall, a Virginian on Pemberton Portage, cleared $2,000 in 1 year after the completion of the wagon road to Anderson Lake, and then had enough money to buy the halfway house property, preempted in 1860 by Peter Dickinson. Preempting land meant driving corner posts or staking around the acreage allowed, then recording the preemption with a magistrate. The settler had to live and improve his land, have it surveyed, and finally pay for it at the rate of $1 an acre. He then received a crown grant. The first Pemberton preemption was recorded at Douglas by P. Smith and Company, who were heavily involved in gold rush business. They were packers. They were owners of a stopping place at Pemberton, and according to more than one account, they were the builders of the wooden tramway between Anderson and Seton Lakes. Joe Tellifer said the tramway was still in use in 1912. A cart coasted one way and was pulled back by a horse. The government's preemption proclamation. Rich land and heavy grass had figured in reports of such men as J.W. Mackay, who was commissioned to find a route to the interior by way of Howe Sound, and of Chief Justice Begbie went on his way south from Cayush. That grass had fed Smith's pack animals before 1860. As the farmers traveled, they had a choice of stopping houses, spaced to accommodate speed of movement. Begbie's 1859 map shows wayside houses at the south end of both Lillooet and Tenas Lakes, and at the Hot Springs, or St. Agnes Well, which had been named after Governor Douglas' daughter. One miner described his mineral water bath in a wooden tub as the only cheap comfort in British Columbia. But those gnarled apple trees, which still bear fruit at Hot Springs, provided another pleasure for travelers. More houses sprang up, including one at Rogers Creek. On his two-day trip home from Douglas in 1863, Lillooet's Anglican priest counted 12 farmers in the Pemberton area. These may have included some men of whom there are scantest of records: George Dunn, John Rogers, Frederick Sylvester, and R. Taylor. R.C. Main met some of the early settlers in 1860 during his survey of the route between Jervis Inlet and the Fraser River, and passed men harvesting crops, sawing lumber, and building houses. It was a bright morning, as July mornings always are here, Main wrote in his report, and he enjoyed the delicious perfume of the tall grasses. Earlier travelers writing of William Curry's beautiful valley tended to write of tangibles. The governor wrote of excellent crops of oat, corn, potatoes, and hay. After exploring the route leading up Cayush Creek and down to Lillooet Lake, Sapper Duffy mentioned the steep hill leading down to the lake. Dr. Cheadle, one of Canada's first tourists, reported on the great number of drinks the magistrate at Douglas had consumed on his way north to Pemberton. Soon after Viscount Milton and Dr. Cheadle went to the Caribou, most of the traffic through Pemberton switched to the Fraser Canyon. The inconveniences of the Harrison-Lillooet route had hastened the building of that new road. The frequent shifting of freight from steamer to wagon or pack train and back again, 8 handlings between Victoria and the Caribou, combined with road closures during heavy snowfalls, had created annoying and expensive delays. The new Caribou Road up the Fraser, begun in 1862, was completed from Yale to Clinton the next year, and the exodus from Pemberton commenced. In 1864, Dodge and Pemberton portages were almost impassable in places. Without a transportation system, the people had no choice but to uproot themselves and move elsewhere. 10 years later, in 1874, only a few settlers remained, and the Lillooet Indians, affected by the frenzied pace of 5 or more years, were returning to their traditional ways. Having no reason for continued existence, Port Pemberton soon died. Only rock foundations show where buildings sheltered men and animals of the gold rush. But the area was never totally forgotten, and for many years before the building of the railway, Vancouver papers carried glowing reports about the land and its potential.
On the water.
Well, you see, what happened is that until 1863, there was another route through Port Douglas, but they finally found that route was too expensive, it was laborious, it was time-consuming, so they built the Second Caribou Road. We're looking now at a picture of the Second Caribou Road. This was started in 1863, snaked through the canyon, and snaked past various obstacles that were very daunting. The Colonel's Retreat, Jackass Mountain, where one step would consign you to a watery grave very, very rapidly, Mike. And so they had to build extremely carefully. Royal Engineers built a lot of this road, blasting out foot by foot, coming up to the depths of the Big Canyon, and then going up the Thompson, and then overland from the Thompson up through Cache Creek, up through Clinton, and eventually into the Caribou Goldfields. They arrived there in 1865.